Mr. Johnson, why is the Islamic religion, more than any other religion, associated with terrorism?
Yeah.
And is that an accurate perception?
I don't think it's an accurate perception, but it's a common perception in the United States today. And I think for some good reasons. First, I think there are a good number of Muslims who, I think maybe for historical reasons, have become frustrated with their state. They feel that they are sort of politically and economically disinherited, and have their backs to the wall and acting out of frustration, as former President Carter said, that they're acting out of frustration and sometimes overstep the bounds of their Islamic teachings. So that while Islam would condemn terrorism, there are Muslims, I think, who are acting out of that frustration who do resort to those kinds of acts.
Is this in reference to the Israeli question?
I think that would be the primary problem, would be the displaced Palestinians.
What can be done to make terrorism less attractive?
Of course, that's a very, very difficult question, and I do agree with Bill Moyers has been asking that question, I think, recently, and again, former President Carter, and I think they really have hit the nail on the head in saying that we have to get at the root cause of the problem. I disagree with Phil Baum, who is the Associate Executive Director of the American Jewish Congress, who says that we need to look at terrorism as simply an abominable act in and of itself and condemn it, regardless of what causes it and regardless of the consequences of it. I think as long as we do that, then we're going to condemn ourselves to see repetitions of the act, because we're not going to get at the root cause of it. So I think that if we can get at that, which would be the rights of the Palestinians to their homeland, that will help that. But I think we also have to be realistic, that there are religious leaders who call themselves Muslims, who are not following the precepts of Islam, who are capitalizing upon this upsurge of Islamic revivalism and are using it to further their own gains. For example, I think Gaddafi would be a good example. The vast majority of the Islamic world would condemn Gaddafi and would say what he's teaching has nothing to do with Islam. And in fact, he's tried to wed socialism with Islamic rhetoric, and Islam and socialism are mutually exclusive. Islam has its own economic system that cannot be wedded to Marxism or socialism. And so by doing that, he's really stepped outside the fold of Islam. Or the Ayatollah Khomeini, who similarly has overstepped the boundaries of Islam by taking hostages and things of that nature that Islam cannot agree with.
Speaking of Khomeini, most of the responsibility for terroristic acts have been blamed on Syria, Iran, and some 20 groups in Lebanon, with Iran often named as the principal culprit.
Mm-hmm.
The death of the Ayatollah Khomeini has been announced as imminent, and may be a matter of fact by the time our interview is aired. With his passing, do you see a decrease in terrorism?
I don't know, and I think it will depend on which group it is will assume power after the death of Khomeini. There is a lot of upheaval within Iran, as there are in most of those countries in that area. The same thing would be with Libya. There have been many, many attempts on Gaddafi's life by Muslim groups themselves inside the country who want to see true Islam established within the country, not the kind that Gaddafi was talking about. Similarly, within Iran, they want to see true Islam that would be more tolerant, that would allow, different religious faiths to practice, which is not the case within Iran. For example, 90% of the Muslims in the world today are not Shiite, they're Sunni Muslims. Iran is a Shia country, and in the constitution of Iran, the Sunnis are listed as another faith. So I think there are other groups that would like to see a more tolerant Islam, and I would hope that the U.S. government would back those more moderate groups.
Does the Islamic religion anywhere in its creed advocate violence or terrorism?
No. Usually when people ask that question, the word they have in the back of their mind is jihad, which is used in the media quite frequently today. And it's translated holy war, which is an unfortunate translation of the word. Literally, jihad means a struggle. And it can be many different kinds of struggle. Preeminently, it's the struggle of the individual to overcome selfishness and to strive for good and to submit his or her entire life to God. But there comes a time when social conditions are so bad that individuals' rights are deprived of them, and that is regardless of their faith, whether they're Jews or Christians or Muslims. And any time the social conditions are such that individual rights are deprived, then the Muslim is required to use force to correct the situation. But that force must be proportional to the end that is desired. And so also a principle of discrimination needs to be used, where we distinguish non-combatants from combatants. So typically in Islam, the women and the children and the old and the sick could not be targets. That's why terrorism is condemned by Islam, or hostage taken of the innocent individuals would be condemned by Islam. Once the just system is established, then no more force can be used. You also cannot use force against any country that you have entered into a treaty relationship with. Even if you think that later on the terms of the treaty are not in your best interest, in Islam you're bound by the terms of the treaty.
You know, in the past, and usually during a war period, ethnic groups have suffered. The Japanese, the Germans in World War II, and World War I, the Germans. During terrible acts of terrorism, and I think most of them are terrible, do the Muslims in this country suffer from public opinion and in other ways? Yeah.
Actually, this year has been a very bad year for Muslims in that regard. We have had mosques bombed. Some Muslim women, of course, Muslim women are required to dress modestly and cover except for their face and hands, so that in many cities their head covering is torn off. I can give an example of just a 9-year-old girl who we were taking to a children's museum, and a 40 to 50-year-old man ripped off her headgear and said, "We don't want your kind in the United States." That's a common kind of occurrence. Just this year, one of the most important of the Muslim scholars in the United States, Ismail Faruqi, was stabbed to death in his home during our holy month of Ramadan with a Rambo knife. He was stabbed about 13 times, I believe. His wife was stabbed as she was cooking the meal. We have a breakfast before we begin our fast, and she was cooking, and she was stabbed to death at the stove. And then their daughter was also stabbed. The acts of violence against the Muslims, as I said, has increased, so that friends of mine I know who have their apartments bombed. Even in my own office this summer, in the premises, they discovered a bomb. It's something that Muslims are learning to live with, but it's very frustrating for the Muslims from overseas when they read the Quran and it says about the Christians that they are the closest to the people, of all the people to them in love, and they come here thinking that they can live peacefully in a Christian country, and that they're the subjects of such kind of aggression.
Yet the Islamic religion allows Christians to live peaceably in their countries.
Exactly.
In fact, you tolerate all religions, do you not?
Right. In fact, there was a point in the history of Islam where one of the religious leaders, who was not a very good Muslim, decided that he wanted to join a mosque onto a church and sort of overcome the church, do away with the church. The Christians complained to the very next religious leader, and he ordered that the mosque be destroyed because the property of a non-Muslim within the Islamic State, is almost sacred. It's inviolate. They have freedom of worship. They're not required to follow Islamic personal law as regards to marriage, etc. In fact, at the time of the Prophet, even punishments for adultery, which are severe within Islam, were not meted out to the non-Muslims. In fact, it was required that they be judged according to their own book. If they were Jews, then according to the Torah, or whatever the law that the Christians had devised for themselves.
One final question, back to your topic here at Ball State, terrorism. Do you feel that terrorism is being encouraged or underwritten by Moscow?
I don't have any kind of empirical evidence that that I could say that, though I have heard talk, and in my travels, many Muslims have the feeling that that would in fact be the case. And we know that in Iran, that Moscow has been very interested in the developments there. You know, for Iran's a strategic location. Similarly, within Pakistan, there were more than 400 invasions by the Soviets themselves along the borders, and the unrest within India and some places like that. We know of the involvement of the Soviet Union, and of course they haven't been free from their own forms of terrorism in Afghanistan, when they plant bombs in the form of toys so that the children's arms and limbs are blown away, deliberately not to kill the kids but to maim them so that they become a burden upon the community, and to demoralize the people. So they haven't been above terrorism themselves. I think the more important thing is how the U.S. will respond. For example, in the case of Libya, I was in the Middle East the week after the bombing in Libya, and it was unfortunate that we took almost an insignificant, pathetic little creature such as Gaddafi and made him a hero in the Middle East because of our actions, where I think if we had taken a less public and open kind of stance,